I was born in Evanston, Illinois, and I come from a large family that was involved in college theater and puppetry. When I was in high school, I spent my entire summers like this, doing hand puppets on my knees, and we actually did well. My father was a college professor, and one of his students was Jerry Jewell. And we can laugh at puppetry, but Jerry went on to write for the Muppets, became the head writer. And you know where those guys went. Mm-hmm. Has anybody seen Dark Crystal? That was a good movie. One of my earliest memories was I decided to scare my father, so I jumped in the back of our 53 Ford. I was all of 4 or 5 years old, maybe 6, and fell asleep. And he woke up halfway to work, where I watched him direct. I think he was directing Pygmalion for Nebraska Educational Television, which was an interesting program at the time in Lincoln because they got a DC-3 and broadcast statewide educational programming to a very rural state that was just nothing but prairie and telegraph wires, and even into the mid-50s. My mother was a concert-level pianist and an actress, college actress. She did what a lot of women did back then, is she got married and had a family. She was quite a fine pianist, and subsequently she became an artist. My mother was extremely critical of all creative work. She knit German style, which is not, if you guys know anything about knitting, most contemporary knitters throw. It's a very slow process, and they knit, they throw. You can remember through your visual memory how they knit. My mother did German style, which is she picked through the previous knitting. So she would knit very fast. But often when she got to the end of the garment, she said, I don't like that. It doesn't look right. So she'd unravel it all and start again. When I went to college, my first freshman year paper, I presented to her and said, well, what do you think? And she said, it's a start. Sounds kind of cold, but the truth is, professionally, a lot of young men and women, and you guys are well past this, don't understand the lexicon of our craft, or any craft whatsoever, whether it's writing or whatever. They're eager, they're interested, they may have some great ideas, but they don't have all the filler in between, and they don't understand how to put it together for themselves. Our challenge as film sound craftsmen is to understand the language of who we work for and put that together in something they can understand and interpret when they can't even speak the language. So we're going to address the issue of how do you talk to people who don't know how to communicate. They can say onomatopoetic sounds, or they can give you adjectives and adverbs, but what does blue mean to you? Sometimes someone says, well, how is it to do a motion picture? And I say, well, okay, I'm a house painter. I've been hired to paint a house, and we paint first room blue. We paint the second room an eggshell off-white. We go to the third room. We're going to paint a mauve, and they come in and say, well, I don't like that blue. That's not blue enough. So we make it a royal blue, and the eggshell is too dark, so we whiten it up, and then we go to the mauve. And I'd really like lavender, and then we've done that before, and the clients come in and say, it's not enough green in that blue. And they keep, and so on and so until we painted the house 4 or 5 times, and all of a sudden we're at the end of it, and the house looks exactly the same as we thought it should be at the first place, with a couple minor trend changes. And I'm sure you've all experienced this kind of issue where most of the time the people we work for don't know how to express themselves. So that's our biggest challenge as applied sound designers, as opposed to, we'll call ourselves poetic sound designers that design sound and installations solely for ourselves, which I'm sure all of us have done or thought about from doing from time to time. But I played clarinet and saxophone. I was in San Jose State's jazz ensemble. I played basically up until my mid-20s. I still have my horn, and most recently I started playing woodwinds again. In spring of '72, I didn't get drafted, and so I decided to go back to film school. I went to USC, and I moved into a rooming house that George Lucas had just moved out of. In fact, I used to get his junk mail. I think once, if you guys recall, I don't know, you may be too young, but General Mills used to have these baking soda battleships. They'd advertise that you'd send in your box tops and put baking soda, not the battleship, submarines, and they'd put baking soda in the submarines and they'd sink, and then they'd rise again. So I opened up to the LA Times looking for work, and I found a job directing. And I directed 21 local commercials where I would hire my friends to shoot it. We'd get our own cameras, rent them from Jack Pill, who's still around, and I'd cut them on a viewer and a splicing block, go to the record session, record my boss, who was a voiceover artist, book the time at the locals, and deliver my own film and video sometimes to NBC, CBS, whatever. And it was interesting work to do. I directed such great commercials as Mr. Beanbag, Sofa Supermarket. I directed and put together the first Dos Equis beer commercial made in the United States. It was just tabletop photography. I shot it in my backyard. I still have my Bolex. It was really fun to do. But I got a call from a school chum, Sandy Ferguson, and she called me and she said, "You don't want this job." And I said, "Sure do. What is it?" So I went to work for Juilliard composer Jaime Mendoza. Jaime was actually an excellent composer. He did, and you may laugh, but he did The Creature from Boggy Creek and The Town That Dreaded Sundown, The Evictors, and I worked on a film called Death Force, which was entitled Black Samurai at the time. Fairly well done. But he introduced me to the concept of using sustained loops to create horror scenarios. So he'd go in with his orchestra and do a variety of loops and modes and tones and chords, and he'd assemble them. And on the dubbing stage, he would put up all these loops and create the score as we mixed, which I thought was pretty impressive. And he wrote some good scores. And back in the day, he had long, flowing hair like any maestro should. And one day he fell asleep at the Mouviel and lost a big chunk of it. Too bad. Anyway, he's passed, but it was a great time. Ultimately, who can't acknowledge the emotional power of ostinata, that low-frequency beating of the mother's heart as felt by the child? Heartbeats by themselves are probably the single most powerful sound effect we can employ. And that's really why we should never use them except in once, twice, very, very little. Or its close cousin, the repetitious low-frequency pulsing of drums, machinery. You guys remember Jaws, right? That na-na, 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 na-na. Someone said once that sound is the first thing we sense and the last. So it's kind of interesting to think of it in that envelope. Sound design for art films, on the other hand, is not such an applied craft, meaning that we're serving another purpose. It can be much purer in its use of sound as metaphor and montage elements, clarifying over obscure or ambiguous imagery. It often can take the place of music. By venturing into the area of musique concrète, with non-causal, recombined, and non-associative sounds that, treated as musical elements, can produce the unlikeliest results. It can wholly be the drama. It really can. We can be the drama. We can be the story. But this is a harder path. And emotionally, yet sound design and effects are a harder path to an emotionally moving film. Music reaches us deeply. That's the way it is. It resonates with its themes and the qualities orchestration gives those themes. And even so, sound effects and their media, and who's to say in 10, 20 years, how much sound design will be the replacement or the handmaiden of the musical experience. How are you guys going to take this and turn it into a language that can be emotionally appreciated by audiences? And that's your challenge. It's a big, tall one to take stuff that the sound effects editing and is only is 50 years old, 60. It only became liberated with the ewer, with that little pocket ewer Frank Warner did most of his stuff with a TC5 or 600, was a little tiny reel-to-reel Sony. Alan Splitt did most of his stuff on Black Stallion with his little tiny 1/8-inch pocket recorder. Alan gave us sounds on Black Stallion that nobody had done before. Nobody had put a set of microphones and a recorder on a horse and given us that point of view of that physicality, that emotional experience of Black Stallion. You guys should take a look at it again. It's pretty incredible. If you don't know what Music Concrete is, it's a movement that came out of Stanford in the early 50s based upon the tape recorder that became available to the public, and so they would play and record sounds, play them in quarter speed, half speed, reverse them, slow them down, speed them up, and make them something that they weren't. And by editing and re-editing, creating rhythmic loops, they created a musical experience out of non-musical sounds. But, you know, in the 20s, are any of you familiar with the Futurists out of Italy? Buongiorno. Come va? Va bene? Sì? All right, I can't do this in Italian. It's been too long. If you guys read about the futurists and you query Russello, he had a theory that the industrial age changed our way of listening, and our cities changed. And as sound designers, we know that the cities go through eras. When I did Deadwood, it was pre-Steam. There were 10,000 miners on the streets every night. And it was all about words and activities. And there was nothing in there to create the drama of the train arriving. So all you could do, everything was, it's like a cowboy and Indians picture, just all physical stuff. Like when I did John Adams, and Rob helped me tremendously with it, and he helped the whole series. Rob created scenarios for us to drop in, because we didn't have sound effects that said, crew dumps barrel on street, rolls it down, lifts it up, puts it in the house. So what Rob did was he went out and had staged all these scenarios that we could put them in places that we didn't have to build out of 15, 20 tracks because they were actively done. I had done that sort of previously on a film called T-Rex, where we were required by Deluxe to do the Foley with the guys in Deluxe Toronto, Andy, somebody or other, and they were great. But I said to Andy, take the money, pay the crew, grab a Nagra, go out and do me all the exterior mining. Give me 20 pickets, this, all the digging. Do it all outside. I don't want it to sound like it's in a box. Because stuff recorded outside, it just, especially high impact stuff with metal, sounds different. And it was great. I hand cut the whole scene. It was wonderful. It was outside Foley. A couple of years ago, Cece Hall, who you may or may not recall, wonderful gal, beat me in a nomination. I took my dad. I was up for Total Recall. And took my dad. He was so thrilled. He bumped into Sean Connery. And he was in a tuxedo. He looked great. And he said to me, Steve, you're not winning tonight. I said, why? I think I've got the better film. I said, well, because you're up against a submarine movie. And it's got Sean Connery. And he was right. You guys want to do a submarine movie? There's a very good chance as a sound designer, man, you should pay them. You get an Academy Award. Because if you look at the history of submarine movies, they always get the acknowledgments because they've got the wonderful aspect of negative space that you can play loads of fun with. And if you guys are starting to work in 7.1 or even more advanced channels, anytime there's a space movie or a space capsule movie or something that's going to give you some legato time to play with depth and silence and the figure versus ground issues of limbo. Do all of you understand what figure versus ground is in terms of artistic ideas? The ideas of a visual idea? Okay. This is a screen. Imagine my finger is my hand. Okay? This is a screen. This is my hand. figure, ground. So by defining the proscenium, the screen, and choosing the size of a figure, you create an implied relationship between existence and the subject. Have you guys ever been to the De Young Museum in San Francisco and seen the brush painting? Or you understand what sumie is, the brush painting, right? Where there was a early branch out of China where I guess a couple monks were, and I can't remember the names. I used to, where they would paint these wonderful landscapes in black and white with a brush, with a Japanese lettering brush, and they would have a very tiny figure way down. And that's a Buddhist idea that we are insignificant in the sense of the whole. And so when you start looking at that and you go, okay, these are all visual stories. Maybe there's something here I'm missing as a sound designer. So we're going to go back to Frank. So I asked Frank, Frank said, what do you do, Frank? Because Frank had done Raging Bull and whatnot. And he said, well, I pull sounds like that. And I told you guys he does the mag thing and the quarter-inch thing and yada, 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 and makes incredible sounds. Okay, that's a technique. I mean, discussing the technique is dwarfed by the impact of the technique. He said, also, I think about sounds as colors. What? Sounds as colors, yeah. Yeah, I take these sounds, and I could call them blue. I call them warm or red, or call them yellow or green. Yeah, I think of sounds as colors. Oh, thanks, Rick. And I chewed on that for a while. So when I was in drama school, I had to take sewing class, and Bob Mackey taught me to sew, and I only stabbed my finger once. Of course, I've never talked to him since he was my TA in Miss Prisk's costume design class at San Jose State. But nonetheless, it's a story to tell. But in one of those classes, they talked about theater color stories, where the costumer would present the color story of the costumes. And I'm sure you're familiar that costumers in theatrical motion picture productions do the same thing. They have a color story. My girlfriend at the time quit film, went into fashion, went into art school. But when fashion, she had a color story for her line of the year. These are my swatches. This is my fabric. This is my color story. These are my visual ideas. I've made a pattern. I'm making a demo of all the clothes. You take the demo out, you sell them, and then you get an order, and you make iterations in sizes. And hopefully, if you make things in beige, the color matches from head to back of the bolt. And the motion picture business is the same way. They get an idea, script, they sell it, they make one copy, and they sell iterations of the experience. So in some ways, it's pretty interesting to think about. You have an idea, you make a template, you make a design for it, and you go make it. And if you're lucky, it'll move people. So the color story is the evolving look and design of the picture in color and shapes and visual configurations that underline, evoke mood, sometimes contrast the action and emotional direction of a picture. I took a class from Les Novros, which was the most fabulous class outside of a story analysis class I took at USC. When I went there, I didn't need to be told how to open and load a Bullx or a Bell & Howell or make a splice. But what I needed to be told was how to think about movies, how to think about the ideas of movies, and how to think about the visual story of movies. And you guys can pick up Bruce Bloch's book, maybe called The Visual Story, and you can get the condensation of his notes, Les Novros' notes. Les did a lot of the original planning on the 2001 A Space Odyssey, all the slit scan stuff. It's very dry and very interesting when you start thinking that you can tell a story with shape and line, chiaroscuro, distance, and parallax. How do we talk to artists and people from literature who are our employers? So that's the crux of everything I'm saying tonight. How do we speak and understand what they mean? Well, most of these guys have played some musical instrument or have some experience with it, and we have to interact with composers. So the best place to go, and I'm sorry I didn't bring it tonight, is you get that page of Italian terms for music, and you probably should just memorize them. Fortissimo, forte, coda, capo, andante. You know, there are about 150 of them. They're just Italian versions of English words, but it makes you sound like you know what you're doing. I got my job with Paul Verhoeven not just because John Davison said, you got to hire Steve to do RoboCop. Because in the first meeting with John, I said, you know, this reminds me when I thought of Joris Ivan's work, documentaries. And he turns to me and says, you know Joris Ivans? Oh, yeah, he did this kind of cut in his documentaries. And he went, I took a class from Joris. Joris was a famous communist documentary maker in the 30s and taught in the Netherlands. One of his good ideas was taking a man or a person who went like that and then cutting to a close shot or some other shot. And it created more interaction between cause and effect of cutting. And it was important because that you could take disparate material and join them in the mind of the viewer. But anyway, so like that, these are little seeds of things you can collect that sooner or later you can turn to the guy who's mixing your music, or it should be a retard here, or it's not this or whatever. Highfalutin, full of yourself, shit, do it. Our object is to raise the stature of our craft and art so that they will understand and appreciate it more, is it not? We're working, after Basic, I started thinking, well, they got all these guys writing these stories based upon all the myths and stories they read in undergraduate school and graduate school. And if you read their bios, you say, oh yeah, I went here, majored in poetry, or historical studies of the mockingbird in southern Argentina, or some obscure stuff. And you go, okay, what influenced them? So you look at the characters, as I said, you understand what the names mean, you understand what the source myths mean. And then, if you want to cheat, you pick up a huge big book by Stephen Booker, best $35 I ever spent. And I don't know if you guys believe in Jungian subconscious and the group myth, but he takes the Joe Campbell Jungian theories and analyzes literature and films and literature, films, poetry, and plays from Beowulf, which actually was only discovered recently, through the Greeks, Lord of the Rings, skips Hamlet for a couple of very interesting reasons, and sort of just like does a quick line, said, if you like this, you should read this. And then goes on. So when I want to find out about a story that I haven't read, like I had never spent the time to read Ulysses by Joyce, although I love Portrait of Artists. So I go there and he's taking it apart and going, okay, that's nice. And that's how it ends? I'm not going to spend my life reading that book. I mean, that's pretty judgmental. And I read 600 words a minute. And at the same time, I didn't like the ending. But what I did was understand the dynamics of character. Dynamics of character create drama. And if you know by reading Lajos Egri's book, The Art of Dramatic Writing, and if any of you want to know all this shit, I'll give you all the books' names, you understand that to create a basic dramatic issue, you separate a unit, a family unit. Kill a wife. Two brothers, one northern, one south, civil war. Kill a husband. Husband vanishes, has suitors. He goes on a trip for 10 years and arrives back and has to compete in an archery contest. Steal a daughter, start the Hellenic Wars. Steal kisses from your king's wife. All this stuff. This is all drama, violating family units. And once you understand that what they're doing, then all of a sudden you go, oh yeah, that's why. That's why they're playing with my heartstrings. And you need to understand this as dramatists, because we are artists and dramatists at the same time, and storytellers. So you should buy Booker's book, and whether you agree with anything he says or not, you should have it at hand because it will help you in an instant understanding references that people may make. It's much faster than Cliff's Notes, and Cliff's Notes don't deal with the psychology of character.
What is it called? Stephen Booker?
7 basic plots. 7 basic plots worth every penny. Highlight it, use it, walk on them with golf shoes, buy a copy for your friends. I don't get any money from it. But Booker's book allowed me to, because I was trying to write with a writing partner, Booker's book allowed me to rethink what we were doing. We are telling stories for audiences. I'm not writing poetry for myself and telling an audience to love it. That's pure, that's applied. I'm not making a soundscape in a museum and saying, this is interesting, this is art. And it could very well be, and we could do that, and that's pure. But I make my living from an applied craft. And the applied crafts business is to be part of a story told to an audience that they will love, cherish, take home, and walk away with. And then come back again and pay more money so we can buy that new washer. You know the worst thing I used to do to my assistants? Pay them more. Oh, don't laugh. This is really not funny. Why? Once you raise somebody's selection of wine, raise their restaurant's 1 grade point, get so that they like and enjoy that vacation with it 2-3 extra days because they're making more money, all of a sudden you've made them bourgeois. It's terribly insidious. You own them because they become addicted. And so it's important to us who enjoy the lifestyle of better foods and wife's takeout, $70 takeout, that you have to fund this addiction. Otherwise, we might go live with Thoreau in the woods in that small cabin. And that's something to be said too, and I could do that. But I live here in Los Angeles, and you guys do too. So we have to think about this as economically as possible, especially in light of the expanding sound design crews in other areas. So if we understand that we tell stories for audiences, then the kinds of pictures that will be successful are the kinds of pictures that audiences enjoy. So why do you think boy meets girl, girl meets boy, yada, yada, yada? Well, that's called new comedy, and that's been around since the Greeks. So this is a formulaic piece of theme and variations that if done properly, everybody's going to love. They're gonna say, oh man, this is great, we got to go see it again. Date movie night. So when you get to pick projects, if you're so lucky, think about what the stories are, what are they telling, and how can you employ your work to make sure that story is cherished and memorable. One of my wife's favorite pictures is that recent Prime Minister falls in love with this girl. U.S. President comes to, he grabs her butt. Prime Minister England tells off the U.S. President.
The Roman Polanski movie?
Huh? The Roman Polanski movie? Moonlighting? No. No.
No.
It's
It was a couple years ago.
Yeah.
And it had
Hugh Grant.
Yes, and it had several different
Grant.
stories
Love
all
Actually?
interwoven
Yeah.
about love.
Love Actually.
Yeah, Love Actually.
Yeah.
Is there a single sound effect in that movie? Man, if they watch it here, time and I can remember the calls in the airport. No, there are sound effects all over the place, but they all serve the story. They're under it. They're nested in. They're all completely plausible. Maybe they didn't come out of a box. Maybe they didn't come out of the CDs that we buy for backup. Maybe all those guys went out and recorded them brand new and they're wonderful, but it doesn't matter because it was part of a story that seems to work for modern audiences. 10 best pictures as of 10 years ago. This is what I feel. Apocalypse Now, 1979, Just Because, start to finish. And these are all from a sound standpoint. Mm-hmm. Raging Bull, expressive, brutal, intense, and not just because of the quality of the punches, but because of the long, sustained mood and tonal elements cut by Frank Warner. He created long arcs of tension. And when Frank presented his reel to the Academy, he said, I don't like this. My work is longer. It's like this. It's not, you can't cut it up in a trailer that's this long. 8.5, 1963.
Mm-hmm.
Everything you want to know about sound effects design is in the first 20 minutes of this movie, period. The only problem is if I brought it, we'd watch the rest of it because it's so good. It is all, but sound effects is all, the sound effects are entirely derived from character. It's all, everything is about his character and how he interacts with his environment. Remember Captain Kangaroo Muffin gets a cinder in her ear? Little animated dog story. Muffin wanders around the streets of New York, blind, because can't see the little dog, and it's all about sounds in New York and how she interacts with him. We should see that again. Take a look at it. See what they did. See how they thought. I mean, do ideas about the way a city sounds change? Do the ideas of what's dramatic change? How would we do it differently? I mean, it's an interesting subject. A black dog wandering around a big city with a cinder in her eye, and she's trying to get home. It's like, Star Wars. Ben Burtt set the modern standard, period. No questions asked, for science fiction. Elephant Man, Alan's picture. The oppressive, steamy industrial age backgrounds throughout became known as Splettian, and that's what you can buy the CD his wife published. And we call them Splettian sounds, and they're all about industrial turmoil or suggestion of something going on in the deep subconscious of the motion picture. And that's Splettian. Think about it. I think that Elephant Man is a more mature and approachable work than Eraserhead, which forecast his talent. I wrote this years ago. War of the Worlds, 1953. Laid down the gauntlet for science fiction films to come with its guitar feedbacks. Good stuff. Even earlier. King Kong, 1933, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at the sound editing on the Beast, it stands to this day. We recorded everything in 4 weeks. We didn't have a library. Recorded it in 4 weeks, cut it in 4 weeks, dubbed it in 4.5. I mean, that's pretty amazing. There one set of changes entirely in the picture. One set, two opticals that cut in. One was practical. And I cut the sequence between them getting to the desert dig to where the stone is pushed out when they go, after they go in the Well of Souls and they get caught by the snakes, they go through the cave, and then they push out, and then there's the fight on the flying wing, bend of the fight. So I did all that. And everything after the first scene I did is perfect. Because when they pick up the staff in the Well of Souls to put the amulet on the top and locate where the sun at the certain hour hits that spot, and it'll tell you where the Ark of the Covenant is. You can hear the sand as they scrape. You can feel this way, that tactily, we understand that the pole is round. I'm really proud of that work I did with Joan, because the pole is round and you can hear it's round. It's just not a touch. You feel it's round. If you guys remember Eddie and the Cruisers, there's a scene where one of the guys gets out, I think the agent, and runs his hand across the top like that. And it's a tonneau top, which is a sort of a hard rubber with little ridges. And you can hear it like a zipper go vop. You go, oh, wow. I have a sense memory. I walked into, I was looking for a present for my wife for Christmas. And I walk into a part of a perfume store, and oddly, there was a man escorting people, as you know, at a women's. Here! I said, well, no. I said, boy, that's interesting. He said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I do sound design, noise film. He said, oh, that's interesting. You know that perfume and sound work the same way in the brain, although perhaps different parts? I said, what? He said, yeah. You want your wife to have a teenage experience? Buy some Old Spice, or buy that cologne that they were wearing when she was like 18. And you go, oh. And I tried it. She said, I hate Old Spice. But Randy Tom once said, sounds like smells evoke sense memories. That he wrote in a book a long time ago. And that's quite true. Was it him or Walter Murch? And you go, oh, yeah. So But they're the different sense memories for every single person. So that's our problem with sound effects. It's not a language that supposedly has a unilateral meaning, which they don't, because we know English is made up of Germanic, Brit, Celtic, Norman French, and Latin roots. So actually, if you look at the dictionary, there are 4 languages we speak as English. Remember your Chaucer? When spring has pierced to the root, right? And you can sort of read it. You can sort of hear it. You can sort of understand it. But that's English. So English is 4 different levels of meaning. And by 4 different levels of expression in language, they created cultural references. You spoke Latin, you were part of the powerful church. You spoke French, you were part of the Norman Uber lords. You spoke Brit and Gaelic and Celtic, you were conquered peoples. Mm-hmm. So language has a variety of meanings. Sound effects have meanings that are individually different, so like perfume. I had a fallout with an ADR mixer, and she goes one day. And I was invited by Joanne D'Antonio into to watch a closed session. I said, "You sure it's all right? It says closed." She said, "Sure, come on in." So I go in, and and the mixer tosses me in. And I said, "Well, Joanne invited me in, and I'm happy to leave, but I wouldn't have come in had she not invited me. So I'm leaving." And I've maintained that grudge for 2 years. So one day, I'm walking down for ADR room that Greg Langdecker used to hole up in the early days at Goldwyn's before it was Morning Hollywood. And, I'm talking to her. I don't know, just nice to her. And she's really nice. And I start talking. Everything's good. About 3-4 minutes into a completely in neutral conversation, I say, "What cologne are you wearing?" And she says, "Oh, I'm wearing, not poison, opium." And I'd been separated from a girlfriend for several years. And it was that sense memory that was driving me to be nice to her, when in fact I held a minor grudge. And I was completely amused. But it's a practical application of the idea that sounds and smells are all very personal. Can all of you remember Starry Night by Van Gogh? Mm-hmm. Remember the blues and my kid's up in college, and she said to me, "I'm doing Starry Night from memory, but the yellow isn't right, and the blue's not right." Whoa, that's interesting. And one day I took her into Tuck Everlasting. She was 14 and completely vocal, and turned to me on the screening, and there were the producers in the room and the director, and said, "He stole that cue." What? "Yeah, I like the movie, but he stole that music cue." "From what?" I can't tell you, but I got to go find it. So we went to Tower Records until she found the cue from Pleasantville that it was exactly like, but it was her favorite movie, Pleasantville, at the time. As a teenage girl, that's what she loved. And it was interesting that she had a sense memory to that, or a sense memory to the blue and the yellow of Starry Night. So I got hired to do at Sony a picture about some missionaries in 1953 that go to convert some indigenous Amazonian tribes that were discovered right after World War II and still spoke a language that no one spoke. So they had to translate it 2 times to get in there. And I got hired at the point when there were no subtitles. And they had hired Panamanian-speaking actors and who also spoke in Indian dialects, delivering actually funny lines. And some of the lines were funny, and they told each other jokes, and they jousted with words like guys in a locker room, and there were a bunch of young men who'd been evicted from their tribe, and they're going to go steal a girl, and yeah, you can't have a girl, you're just nothing like it. All that teenage jock boy stuff that is kind of absurd but typical. But I didn't understand what they were. I couldn't read the script. It was like there wasn't really a script because it was all written in that language. It was written phonetically. So I turned to the director and said, I can cut this and it's going to be good. But why don't you, I said, do you know about a color story where not like the colors of the picture that are on the screen that you photograph, but a color story of not like the swatches of a costumer or a production designer, but a color story from your intellect that says emotionally how you want an audience. You give me a color story of colors that how you want, as interpreted by an audience to feel. Because that's really a big question when you interview your director. How do you want an audience to feel at any one particular moment? What is the emotional effect you're going for? Theme, variations. Are you doing a dialectic between what's really on screen but what's really happening? Do you want to create a conflict with, for, against the character? These are all good dramatic questions you need to understand when you spot a film with a director. It's really important to understand how he wants the audience to feel, which is an odd question. So I said, can you make me a color story? And I thought, okay, I forgot about it. I walked out the door. And then he gave me this a week later. Pass it around. End of the Spear, color story. What you'll see is each sentence describes a scene. And if you look at, he's done a thing with pastels and Adobe, that he's moved like a blot thing. But as you watch it and you pretend you're reading it like an evolving slit scan, you say, oh, there are these colors, but what do they mean to me? How do I feel when they see these colors? And gradually, as I started cutting the film and the backgrounds, not the hard effect, they became invaluable because I go, okay, I've got the scene transition and it's got thunder and rain, and you go, but is it close? Is it open? Is it positive? Is it negative? How do I want it to feel? And he gave me that. And that's stunning, and it's extremely flattering. And that's a color story. It's always chancy when you start asking your employers or your benefactors about how they think, feel, and to reveal themselves creatively. So you gotta read the room. I was talking to Walt Newman yesterday morning, who's a big TV guy at Warner Brothers, and I said, well, Walt, how'd you get involved in this? Because he's an interesting guy in some ways, real crusty and direct and blunt. In some ways, I very much like him. He said, well, I got it because of my dad, but he didn't ask me in. I said, oh, yeah, he had to flee Hitler before the war, and he's Austrian. And, where'd you go to school? What'd you get? What did you study in school? Social psychology. Went, duh. I said, I bet you use that more than anything you learn in sound. He said, absolutely.